Maria King is a subject librarian in the School of Health and Social Care here at Edinburgh Napier, and she joined the university relatively recently, just in May this year. She previously worked in a very similar role at Coventry University, and before that she was at the University of Salford. Her role involves delivering teaching and other student support sessions focusing on information literacy, including the critical use of sources. Maria has always been interested in improving her own pedagogy since working in higher education roles involving teaching, and her interest in punk pedagogy developed both from a professional interest in critical pedagogy, but also from a personal perspective as someone involved in the punk music scene. Oh, I've just spun back in time, Maria. This is joyous. So I'm going to hand over to you to talk with us for the next 30 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can I just double check that my sound is okay and that you can hear me clearly, Fiona?
The sound is great, okay, and I can see your screen.
Brilliant, thank you. So as Fiona said, I'm the subject librarian, one of them at Napier University for the School of Health and Social Care. What I'm going to cover today then is three main things: what punk pedagogy is, its influence on my practice, and then also looking at the challenge of having that sort of ethos whilst working in higher education. I'll probably look at my second screen quite a bit because that's where my slides are, so don't think I'm being odd if I'm looking over that side. So just to give you a bit of an overview of me and my role really here, I primarily liaise and I'm the link between the school and the library, and that involves teaching, so related to information literacy, things like referencing and other academic skills around being critical, so things like critical appraisal, systematic reviews and so on. And then I also do student and researcher one-to-one appointments as part of that support. And I'm also responsible for the book budget and stock management for the resources for that school as well. So I'll talk more in the session about how punk pedagogy impacts my practice in relation to these areas. So in terms of what it is as a theory, really, we aren't actually talking about it as, you know, the music itself and that sort of scene, but more as a pedagogical practice. So it's about the idea of values coming from that scene being embedded within the practice within, you know, teaching and academia and higher education more generally. And there isn't really a single definition. I'm going to cover in a couple of slides some of the principles and what some of the key scholars in this field have been, you know, using to describe what it is. But there isn't sort of a single definition like you get with some other theories and models, and that I think in itself would be a bit of an oxymoron to the whole concept. So the way I describe it is it's more a frame of mind. So primarily somebody who's challenging the institutionalized order, someone who's interrogating assumptions in their discipline, someone who's disrupting dominant orders and ideologies. And I think when I've presented about this before, some people have sort of recognized the way that they're then sort of approaching their field in this way without necessarily consciously seeing it as punk pedagogy. And I think there's quite a lot of overlap between, you know, critical pedagogy is definitely a form of that. So if you sort of feel that this fits a lot of your approach, then you may want to refer to that afterwards. So here are some of the key scholars and how they've described what punk pedagogy is and some of the principles. And I would say primarily that these do link with other theories and pedagogies. It's not necessarily things that are just exclusive to punk pedagogy, but there are some, you know, differences or some things that make punk pedagogy what it is and you know, differentiate it from other theories. So that is what I would say: perspective of strong values and ethics, and this resistance to the perceived status quo and challenging the institutionalized order. I would describe it probably as sort of a mix between critical pedagogy and social justice. So a lot of this is looking at strategies for resistance against dominant orders and how you can challenge. So I would say mainly it's got common principles with constructivism or social constructivism, but really it's that sort of DIY, have a go approach that, you know, probably makes it a little bit different and links to some of these in some ways as well. The idea of experiential learning is linked to DIY, which you can see within those particular theories as well. So the links really to critical pedagogy, I would say modern punk really is a movement that fits the principles of modern critical pedagogy, so the sort of general attitude of modern punk. And I think some people may see punk as it was traditionally back in the 70s and 80s. And I think at that time there was quite sort of a large skinhead movement, which to some aspects, you know, it still does prevail a little bit in the scene, but I would say modern punk primarily is extremely left-wing, and a lot of you know, features and values and ethics do align with critical pedagogy and some of the other things that different presenters today have been talking about already. And again, just a couple of scholars in this field and how they sort of see punk pedagogy linking in with critical pedagogy. So in terms of how it influences my practice then, these are the areas that I'm going to cover in today's session. So my role as an educator, how I encourage criticality within my sessions and supporting students, how this links in with underrepresented voices. I'm going to talk a little bit about use of resources, as in sources in terms of as part of assignments, etc. The student ownership of learning and flexibility of engagement. So in terms of my role as an educator then, and sort of punk pedagogies, how that sees the role of an educator is very much about a facilitator of learning, coaching and scaffolding, not sort of telling, if you will. And the other thing that's really a key proponent of punk pedagogy is about the fact that teachers are also learners. So it's not a case of this sort of the teacher as an omnipotent, all-knowing being. It's about, you know, sharing the learning and being able to admit that sometimes you don't know things. You can say that you don't know the answer to something and try and break this stereotype, and being a constant learner yourself, and that idea of the learning never stopping. So I think some of the roles of sort of teacher student are very much more broken down, and people are seen as equals within punk pedagogy. Another really key element in terms of your role as a teacher is about this idea of constant reflection and reflection on your own sort of pedagogy, your own you know, abilities, your own skills, etc., and improving the learning. And not necessarily, you know, blaming everything that goes wrong on the students in the room, and maybe sort of taking a minute to think about, well, what could I do differently? How can I get better? How can I change my approach? So much more of a reflective way of being. And trying where you can to actually provide opportunities for students to provide feedback on you and your teaching, and actually put that into practice and make changes. And I know we all have to do that in, you know, some sort of formal way, but I try and do it in a more informal way rather than sort of just like looking at an NSS at the end of the year, and make it much more of a normalized thing, and, you know, okay, make it more of an open discussion. In terms of criticality then, again, this is just what some different scholars within the field have sort of said about how it links to the idea of being critical and critical thinking. And I think in order to challenge and interrogate, by the nature of that, you have to be critical. So I suppose my role as a librarian is not only necessarily being critical myself, but I'm actually teaching students how to think critically about what they're reading, about sources they're using, so the critical reading aspect, and then how they then incorporate those into their assignments. So in terms of how that translates to my practice then, it's this idea of how to think, read and write critically, how do they actually know what to critique? How do they actually build these skills if they've not necessarily been taking this approach before they come to university? What can I do to sort of support that teaching? So a lot of that is, you know, buying stock that helps them with that, but also as part of my teaching and support sessions. So especially within the health school, I do a lot of teaching on critical appraisal. So some of that involves, you know, specific tools that exist for doing that kind of critique, and just generally encouraging sort of the discussion of ideas, different viewpoints, debate. So quite interactive learning sessions that then encourage that critical approach. But I think there's a lot of challenges with this, and I've come across challenges personally myself in terms of teaching critical appraisal and being critical. One example I had from my previous institution is I was asked to deliver a teaching session to a group of biomedical science students on how to critically appraise journal articles. So that's what I did, and we had a formative assessment as part of the module, and the academic, the module leader, provided a journal article that they had to critique as part of that formative assessment. So that's what we used in the example for my teaching session, and I basically taught them how to use the critical appraisal tools, how to think about things from, you know, both perspectives, looking at strengths, weaknesses, etc. I didn't understand anything about the article because I'm not a biomedical scientist in any way. And then after the formative assignments, the module leader complained that I taught the students about how to negatively critique a journal article that was very highly regarded and that he thought was brilliant. So to me, that's, you know, there's a bit of a clash there of actually, if you're picking something that you think is fantastic, but a student actually picks up a lot of weaknesses that you disagree with, are they in the wrong just because they have a different perspective, because they've critiqued something in a different way to you? So that was an interesting one. And I think this can often happen in terms of, you know, researchers and, you know, academics. I'm sure you've been reading about the University of Leicester, where a lot of academics who were made redundant were people who were doing a lot of research into challenging current HE ideologies, and they didn't feel it was a coincidence that they were the ones that were made redundant. So I think there are a few, you know, examples out there of, you know, researcher funding or redundancies related to what you're researching and what your ideologies are challenging. So I think for me, I, you know, really sort of promote to students that it is okay to critique academic sources, that you don't have to agree with everything, and that's not a bad thing. And creating that sort of learning environment where actually they feel comfortable and confident to be able to have a different point of view to, you know, you or an academic or whoever it is, and that there isn't always a right and a wrong answer when it comes to sort of discussing and critiquing ideas. And I suppose that links in with some of the wider academic practice discourses as well around sort of the right and wrong ways to even do an assignment. So who actually decides what these are? And it's almost needing to get a balance between needing an assignment brief and a marking criteria, but also allowing flexibility of how you sort of assess people's writing and reading and how that, you know, how they're completing assignments. And I think this links back a little bit to what Louise was saying about this, you know, the script that she had around this flexibility of assignment, and the academics saying that they couldn't possibly mark a website compared to somebody who's done an essay. And actually, do we need to think a bit more creatively about how we determine what the right and wrong way to demonstrate your knowledge of something is? So potentially, if they're actually learning how to sort of write in the right way and sort of fit a mold, are we actually de-skilling students if we're then restricting their flexibility of assignment completion or demonstration of thoughts, ideas, etc.? And then the other thing linked to that as well is students sort of learn who they need to quote quite often, because mainly got a reading list, or you're being told these are the key scholars in a particular field, and how much are we expecting students to sort of find these ideas and find perspectives themselves? How are we directing them to who they should be reading? So I think, again, there needs to be a balance between getting them started, but also not sort of restricting who they might actually choose to include in their views, etc. So this links in then also with underrepresented voices, particularly when it comes to sort of sources. So I think generally, this is from one of the Punk Pedagogy scholars, and I've got reference lists at the end so you can access all the sources. Generally, sort of HE is perpetuating inequality, but especially when it comes to things like use of sources and reading. I'm sure you've seen, you know, things that talking about sort of decolonisation or diversifying of reading lists, which is something that me and my colleagues are looking at in the library at the moment in terms of how we can support academics to diversify reading lists. Some of the other conscious things that we're doing, we've just written a new referencing guide, and we've consciously made sure we've selected diverse resources as examples, so that it doesn't just read in quite a non-diverse way, which unfortunately some of the reading lists and examples have done previously. And then the other thing that I try and get people to consciously think about is the types of sources that we're actually expecting students to use in assignments. So because of the nature of how sources have been produced and sort of the publishing landscape, generally, there are certain marginalised voices that don't get well represented in, you know, academic sources. So if we're then encouraging students to only use, you know, high quality academic sources and not use anything that will be considered as grey literature or non-academic, are we actually, you know, minimalising the voices and experiences of marginalised groups in how we sort of encourage students to learn about a topic, but then also incorporate them into their assignments as well? So I think, again, it comes down to who's deciding that a certain source type is better and more important. Things like the peer review process, again, that very much sort of favours groups of people who are already more socially advantaged, and again is having a negative impact on underrepresented voices and certain marginalised groups. And therefore, if we're only saying to students, these are the types of sources you have to learn from, they're then missing out a lot of valuable experiences and viewpoints and perspectives. So one of the things that I try and do is promote sources from different perspectives and backgrounds, and I've got you know, like a subject guide where I can list resources. So I try and list a lot of open access resources, things like the African Journals online collection, which aren't necessarily coming through, you know, your standard databases and the databases that you might come across in Western countries more often. The other thing is copyright restrictions. They're generally not very punk. It doesn't really fit with the whole sort of DIY, sort of make and reuse kind of approach. So where I can, I will always try and buy things that are DRM, so copyright free, meaning that students can get better access, you know, using resources where they've got images that they can use, copyright free images and things like that, and generally trying to promote open access sources. And that is also something that I might discuss with researchers. So if a researcher is talking to me about where would you recommend that I publish, I can talk to them about our read and publish open access deals, show them how they can access journal information and check open access or hybrid journals and what journals are doing to try and improve their open access you know, amounts, etc. So I think quite a lot of the time we don't necessarily see it as more than, let's just diversify a reading list, let's put, you know, a few resources on there that weren't written by white males. But I think it needs to go a lot deeper than that, about thinking about even the sort of the whole source creation and how that perpetuates inequality as well. Another key element of punk pedagogy is student ownership of learning. So I think this really links with that sort of DIY principle. So learning for oneself is quite a long-standing principle. So I think this is something, again, that I try and do through my learning around independent research skills. And I would try to encourage academics to, say, not have a really extensive reading list, but maybe just have a few key texts, and then encourage students to sort of use that as a starting point, but go out and do a lot more research themselves. So a really sort of key element of my teaching is teaching people how to develop those research skills that they can then go and use to find their own sources and research, and finding things out for themselves as well. And then a couple of other ways of how I sort of put this into practice, not necessarily always coming with sort of a really sort of strict script, I suppose, when I'm teaching, sort of allowing myself to go off topic and change what I cover. So I might ask the students at the start, which of these areas of academic skills do you want me to cover today, or are you struggling with most? Maybe sort of tailor things to their assignment feedback and areas where they need more support. Very much about teaching transferable skills. So yes, tailoring it to an extent so they can see how to put it into practice, but always really stressing how what we're doing is transferable and how they can then put that into practice themselves. And I think as well, ensuring that the students are also transmitters of knowledge. So I often do things in a bit more of a playful way, such as the database top trumps, where I give them all like a database in groups. They have to go and learn about that and present it to the back to the rest of the room, and basically teach each other how to use databases or what the benefits of a specific one are over another one, etc. So I think, again, that's linking back to that role of the educator, and both students and staff being educators in a way. Again, this links a little bit with what Louise was showing us in her script also, and also what Zach was talking about in terms of false generosity. So this idea of flexibility of engagement and giving students the options for flexibility, whether that's during a session. So it might be we're doing an activity live in class, and are there different ways that different people could participate in the same activity? Being able to sort of learn at your own pace. So again, what I'll quite often do if I'm creating asynchronous resources will be to create shorter things that they can dip in and out of at the level that they are with their own learning, rather than something that everyone has to do. So things like, you know, choices of an activity or choices of a worksheet for learning about the same topic. And I think it's important, like what Zach was saying about the false generosity there, not just saying, oh yes, we're going to be flexible, but then placing lots of restrictions on it. So actually listening to what students suggest as maybe a better way to do something, or a way that's going to, you know, help them. And again, in things like group work sessions, if there's somebody who's getting on with the work but isn't working in a group, I would never push them to then work in the group, because they're still engaging and they're still getting on with what they need to. So I would see that there'll be no need to. And then the last thing that I want to cover, I'm just conscious of time, is this sort of oxymoron and the challenges around sort of being punk in higher education, if you will. So I think the characteristics of being punk, of what I've already been talking about, this idea of challenging, you know, higher education and these dominant, you know, practices, don't always fit with being part of an institution. And there can be a lot of sort of clash between your own ideologies and being part of an institution that primarily is becoming more sort of market-based and creating, you know, workers rather than educating for the enjoyment of having an education, I guess. And I think this has been picked up on by some scholars within the field of punk pedagogy, and pointing out how they actually, you know, seem like oxymoron terms. And there was an album made by it's a compilation of punk bands where at least one of the members are part of an educational institution. So, you know, schools, colleges and higher education. And I think the key thing, this is a quote from, a member of one of the bands on that album, and it's about, really stressing that the outsider perspectives need to be working from the inside. They need representation from within for the change to actually happen. And you can't challenge as effectively if you're on the outside. So I think there are, like, I have a lot of friends who work in education who, I know through the punk music scene. I think there definitely is that sort of, feeling of you have to be in there to actually make a difference. I think some of the challenges mainly are thinking about your own sense of identity and this sort of worry about sort of selling out or compromising your own values, and how you balance that with, some of the things that you might be asked to do that you don't agree with, and also thinking about how it comes across if you are constantly challenging things. So if you're constantly sort of challenging your manager or challenging, a senior leadership team, sometimes you can then come across as a bit of a troublemaker, or you can be seen as the problem person. So it's almost this sort of idea of being political about it, picking your battles, thinking of ways that are maybe a little bit more subtle. How do you get other people on board so that you've got maybe more of a majority? And thinking about things like, when you do want to question things, bring evidence. So bring things to back up your perspective, things that are going to sort of make sense to, a management team, senior leadership team, whatever group it is, but sort of think about it from their perspective, what is going to work for them to actually sell this and get this challenge in a sort of political way, if you will. And that is the end of the session. I have 2 slides of references for you there as well. And I can see there has been a few questions that have come through, but I have ignored them. And I know we're going to be doing the panel after the next speaker.